Story number 1.
The first few weeks in my new home felt like a dream. It was a quiet, charming little house tucked into a suburban neighborhood that seemed to have stepped out of an old postcard. Trees lined the streets, and people waved when they passed by. The air was fresh, and the houses were spaced just far enough apart that you could still have privacy, but close enough to feel like you were part of a community. My neighbors, the Thompsons, lived next door. They were a middle-aged couple, friendly but not overly involved. The wife, Karen, was always out in her garden, and her husband, Paul, was a retired engineer who spent most of his time tinkering in the garage. They had 2 grown children who visited occasionally, but for the most part, they seemed to enjoy their peace and quiet. At first, I didn't think much of them. They seemed perfectly ordinary, and I was more interested in settling into my new life than in getting to know them too well. I moved into the house in late spring when everything was blooming and the air was thick with the scent of flowers. It was an idyllic setting. But as the weeks wore on, I started noticing little things that didn't add up. It started with the strange noises coming from the Thompsons' house. At night, when I was lying in bed, I could hear sounds that I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaking of an old house settling. But then, one evening, I heard what sounded like muffled footsteps. Steady, heavy footsteps that seemed to move around inside their house. I thought it was probably just Paul, but it was late, well after midnight, and the sound didn't stop for hours. It was as though someone was pacing back and forth. I lay there, wide awake, wondering if I should go next door and check, but that seemed silly. After all, it was probably nothing. But then it happened again the next night. And the night after that. By the 4th night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The pacing seemed deliberate, as if someone was trying to make a point by walking back and forth in the dark. I stood at my bedroom window, staring across the yard into the Thompsons' house. The lights were off, but I could see the faint outline of figures moving through the curtains, the shadows of people walking around. I felt an unease creeping over me, but I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. I hadn't lived in a house this old before, and maybe it just made strange noises at night. Still, there was a lingering feeling that something wasn't right. The following evening, when I came home from work, I saw Karen standing in her front yard. She was holding a rake, staring down at the ground with a vacant expression. I waved as I walked past her, but she didn't respond. I thought maybe she didn't see me, but then I noticed something strange. Her hands were gripping the rake tightly, knuckles white, and her body was perfectly still, like she wasn't breathing. "Karen?" I called out, stepping closer. Her head snapped up suddenly, as though she had been jolted out of a trance. Her expression shifted to one of confusion, and then she smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile I was used to. It was too wide, too forced. "Oh, hello," she said, her voice sounding too cheerful. "I didn't hear you. How's everything?" I was taken aback by her sudden shift in demeanor, but I tried to brush it off. "It's fine, just getting settled. I noticed you out here. Everything okay?" Karen hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to answer. Then she nodded quickly. "Oh, everything's fine, just out here doing some yard work. You know how it is." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a tension in her voice, a hidden unease that didn't match her outward appearance. I smiled politely and excused myself, deciding it was probably best to leave it alone. But that night, things took an even stranger turn. I had just settled into bed when I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the direction of the Thompsons' house. It wasn't loud, just soft enough that I could barely hear it over the hum of the air conditioner. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it happened again, 3 distinct knocks. I froze, heart pounding. It was coming from inside their house, not the door, but the walls, or maybe the floor. It was a rhythmic, deliberate tapping. It sounded like someone was trying to communicate in some way, knocking out a pattern. I waited for it to stop, but it didn't. I didn't know what to do. Should I go over there? Should I call the police? My mind raced with possibilities, but then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The house was silent. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I went outside to check the mailbox, and as I walked back to my porch, I saw Paul sitting in his garage, working on some kind of project. He looked up and waved I waved back. I considered asking him about the noises, but I hesitated. I didn't want to seem like I was prying, especially if it was nothing, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Hey, Paul," I called out, walking closer. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering, have you been hearing any strange noises at night, like tapping or pacing?" Paul didn't seem surprised by the question. In fact, his expression darkened just for a moment before he forced a smile. "No, nothing like that. Why do you ask?" "I don't know," I said, feeling foolish. "I've been hearing some strange sounds from your house late at night, and I was just wondering if maybe it was the house settling or something." Paul paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly before he shook his head. "We're fine. Nothing to worry about." I could tell he was lying. It wasn't just the way his eyes darted to the side, it was the nervous way he spoke, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. I nodded and walked back inside my house, feeling a growing sense of unease. The days that followed were even stranger. Karen and Paul became more distant, not just from me, but from everyone in the neighborhood. They stopped attending community events and stopped making small talk when they saw their neighbors. Their house grew quieter, too. No more yard work, no more tinkering in the garage. It was like they had vanished. One evening, about a week later, I decided to check on them again. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I walked over to their house and knocked on the door. There was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder this time, but still nothing. I tried the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, the door creaked open. It wasn't ajar, but it was as though it hadn't been fully closed. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The house was eerily silent. I called out, "Hello?" but my voice sounded strange in the empty air. I stepped further into the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Everything seemed normal at first, no sign of a struggle or disorder. But then, as I passed the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor just inside the door was a small pile of dirt. It was fresh, as if someone had dug up the floor. The pile was perfectly circular, like it had been carefully placed there. I bent down to inspect it, and that's when I noticed the faint smell of something decaying. I turned to leave, my heart racing. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard something behind me. It was a low, guttural sound, almost like a whisper. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Panicking, I backed toward the door, but before I could reach it, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see Karen or Paul standing there. But there was nothing. Then a voice, Karen's voice, whispered from the shadows, "You shouldn't have come." I ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back as I rushed home. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The next day, the Thompsons' house was empty. The cars were gone, their yard was overgrown, and no one in the neighborhood had seen them in days. The house stood silent, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that whatever had happened to the Thompsons, it was too late for them. And maybe, just maybe, it was already too late for me. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When I first moved into my apartment complex, everything seemed perfect. It was a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, affordable and well-maintained. The tenants mostly kept to themselves, which suited me just fine. I wasn't looking to make new friends, I just needed a place to live. The unit next to mine had been vacant when I moved in. The leasing office told me someone had rented it but hadn't moved in yet. Weeks passed, and I never saw anyone come or go, though I occasionally heard faint sounds through the walls. Soft thuds, muffled voices, the creak of footsteps. Then one evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw the new tenant for the first time. He was standing just outside his door, staring at me. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. His clothes were wrinkled, and his thin, pale fingers twitched at his sides. There was something unsettling about the way he watched me. His head tilted slightly, his lips parted just enough to show yellowing teeth. I forced a polite nod. "Hey, I guess we're neighbors." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned, opened his door, and disappeared inside. I stood there for a moment, shivering despite the warm night air. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just shy. Maybe he had social anxiety, or maybe I was just reading too much into it. But then things started getting strange. The noises coming from his apartment grew louder. I'd hear furniture scraping against the floor at odd hours, a slow dragging sound that sent chills up my spine. Sometimes it was knocking, not knocking on my door, but inside his apartment, like he was tapping on the walls. One night around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was so faint that at first I thought it was just my imagination. But as lay there, holding my breath, I realized it was coming from the shared wall. I pressed my ear against the wall. I heard him whispering my name. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind or the pipes, or then 3 distinct knocks, right against my bedroom wall. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I saw him again. I was leaving for work when I spotted him standing at his window, peering out through the blinds. When he saw me, he grinned. It wasn't a friendly grin. It was something else. Something predatory. I hurried to my car and drove off, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my stomach. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it was more frantic, harder, like he was pounding on the walls. I put in my headphones and tried to ignore it. But then, a scratching sound. It started at the far end of the wall and slowly moved closer, like someone was dragging their nails across the surface. My entire body went cold. I had had enough. I grabbed my phone and typed out a message to the apartment manager. I think the guy next door is messing with me. Loud noises, knocking, whispering. Can you check on him? I hesitated before hitting send, feeling ridiculous, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. The reply came the next morning. That unit is vacant. No one has lived there for months. I read the message over and over, my hands shaking. No, that wasn't possible. I had seen him. I had heard him. I had spoken to him. I ran to the leasing office demanding an explanation. The manager frowned. We haven't rented that unit since last year. The last tenant, well, he passed away. My stomach dropped. What? She hesitated, lowering her voice. His name was Richard Hensley. Lived alone. His body wasn't found for weeks. I felt lightheaded. How did he die? They said it was a heart attack, but she looked uncomfortable. When they found him, he was in his closet tub. The door was locked from the inside, and there were scratch marks all over the walls. I left the office in a daze. My legs felt weak as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. As I passed the door to the vacant unit, I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock from the inside. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The neighbors had always been friendly, or at least I thought they were. When I moved into the small suburban neighborhood, it seemed like the perfect place to settle down. The houses were quaint and close-knit, and the people always waved when they passed. My new neighbors, the Thompsons, lived in the house next to mine. I'd seen them at the local market and exchanged pleasantries, but we hadn't gotten to know each other too well. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when things started to feel off. I was sitting in my living room reading a book when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I got up to answer it anyway. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Thompson, holding a casserole dish in her hands. She smiled warmly as she greeted me. Hi, Sarah. I made too much for dinner tonight. Would you like some? I hesitated, not wanting to be rude. That's really sweet of you, but I've already eaten. Oh, no problem at all, she said, her smile never faltering. Just thought I'd offer. I thanked her for the kind gesture and closed the door. But as I returned to my seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was strange about the visit. It wasn't her generosity that bothered me. It was the way she lingered for just a moment too long on the porch, as though she was waiting for something. But I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things. The next few days, I saw more of the Thompsons. Mr. Thompson, a quiet man in his mid-40s, stopped by to ask if I needed help with some yard work. Their teenage daughter, Emily, came over to introduce herself. They were friendly, yes, but it started to feel like they were trying too hard. It was as though they were overly invested in my life, and it made me uncomfortable. I began noticing other odd things, too. There were times when I would hear faint noises coming from their house at night, scraping sounds as if something heavy were being dragged across the floor. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from a family just watching TV or going about their evening routine. It was unsettling, but I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. Then, one evening, I came home to find that my front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. Panic set in as I stepped inside, but everything seemed to be in place. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Still, my heart was racing. I locked the door behind me and made a mental note to be more careful next time. The real horror began the following week. It was around midnight when I woke up to the sound of my front doorbell ringing. I groggily checked the time. There was no reason anyone should be at my door at this hour. I peeked through the blinds but couldn't see anyone. The porch light illuminated the wet pavement, and there was no sign of movement. Confused, I decided to ignore it and go back to bed. But the doorbell rang again. This time, I rushed to the window and saw a figure standing at the edge of my yard. It was Mrs. Thompson. She was staring directly at my house, her hands clasped together in front of her, unmoving. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My phone was on the nightstand, but I didn't want to risk making noise. After what felt like an eternity, she turned and walked back to her house without so much as a glance back. The next morning, I was still rattled. I decided to go next door and ask if anything had happened the night before. When I knocked, Mrs. Thompson answered, her face a picture of sweetness, as always. "Morning, Sarah. How are you today?" I couldn't help but feel uneasy. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson. I'm okay, but I just wanted to ask, did you come by my house last night?" Her face didn't change, but there was a slight pause before she responded. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I didn't realize I had disturbed you. I must have been sleepwalking or something." I frowned, unsure whether she was joking or if she was being serious. "You were standing on my lawn at midnight. It was really strange." Her smile remained, but there was something darker lurking in her eyes. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. I'll be more careful next time. Don't worry about it." I nodded, but I wasn't reassured. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. It wasn't just her behavior. It was the whole atmosphere of the neighborhood. The Thompsons seemed too perfect, too eager to get close to me. Later that day, I decided to do a little digging. I had been so busy settling into my new home that I hadn't thought to research the neighborhood's history. It didn't take long for me to find something strange. The previous owner of my house had moved out under mysterious circumstances. I dug deeper and found that there were a few other families who had lived in my house before me, each of them leaving abruptly after a short time. The more I looked into it, the more I realized there was something unsettling about the entire block. Many of the neighbors had lived here for decades, but the newcomers, like myself, never seemed to stay long. That night, I stayed up late, determined to figure out what was going on. Around 2 a.m., I heard the scraping noise again, coming from next door. It was louder this time, like furniture was being overturned. I crept to my window and peered out, but the curtains in the Thompsons' house were drawn tight. I couldn't see anything. Then I heard a loud bang. My heart raced, and I immediately grabbed my phone. I called the police, though I wasn't sure what I was going to say. "There's something wrong with my neighbors," I told the dispatcher, my voice shaking. "Ma'am, can you describe what's happening?" the dispatcher asked. "I don't know. I hear noises from their house all the time. Tonight, it sounds like furniture being thrown around. I don't know what's going on over there, but it's not normal." The dispatcher assured me that someone would be by to check it out. I waited, my nerves frazzled, but the police never showed up. The next morning, I decided to confront the Thompsons once and for all. I knocked on their door, and Mrs. Thompson answered with her usual smile. This time I couldn't hold back. "Mrs. Thompson, what's going on in that house? There's something off about you and your family." She didn't flinch. Instead, her smile widened, and she stepped closer to me. "You don't have to worry about us, Sarah. We're just trying to be good neighbors." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "I'm not asking to be your friend," I said, my voice trembling. "I just want to know the truth. What's happening in that house?" She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Sometimes, Sarah, people who don't belong here don't stay for long, just like the others before you." Her words echoed in my mind as she closed the door without another word. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care where I went. I just had to get away. As I drove out of the neighborhood, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the Thompsons standing in their yard, watching me leave. Their smiles never faltered. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I moved into my new home in late autumn. It was a quiet cul-de-sac in a small town where people took pride in their well-kept lawns and decorated porches. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, or at least pretended to. It seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. My next-door neighbor was an older woman named Mrs. Collins. She must have been in her late 60s, with frail limbs and a hunched posture. She lived alone in a house that had probably been beautiful once, but had since fallen into disrepair. The shutters were crooked, the paint peeled, and the front porch sagged slightly. Despite her home's appearance, Mrs. Collins herself was warm and welcoming. She greeted me with homemade cookies the day I moved in and told me stories about the neighborhood. She had lived there for nearly 40 years, watching families come and go. "You seem like a good young man," she said, her watery blue eyes locking onto mine. "It's good to have decent people around again." I thanked her, but the way she said again stuck with me. At first, everything was normal. I spent my days unpacking, getting used to my new job, and settling into my routine. But it wasn't long before I noticed something strange. Mrs. Collins never turned her lights off. No matter how late I stayed up, her house was always illuminated. A dim glow seeped through the curtains, flickering like candlelight. I told myself maybe she just liked to keep a nightlight on. Maybe she was afraid of the dark. Then there were the noises. Late at night, I would hear shuffling sounds coming from her house. Slow, dragging footsteps, moving from room to room. Occasionally, I heard soft murmuring like she was talking to someone, but I never saw anyone visit her. One night, I was taking out the trash when I glanced up at her house. Through the front window, I saw her standing in the dim light, staring at the wall. She wasn't moving, just standing there, motionless. A shiver ran down my spine. The next morning, I ran into her as she was tending to her overgrown garden. She smiled as if nothing was wrong. "Didn't mean to stare last night," I said, trying to make light of it. "You okay?" She paused, her hands gripping the gardening shears. "Oh, don't mind me," she said. "I get lost in my thoughts sometimes." She changed the subject quickly, asking me about my job, my family, normal things, but something about the way she deflected the question made me uneasy. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound. Knocking. It was coming from her house. Not from the door, but from inside. Slow, deliberate knocks like someone was trying to get out. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The knocking continued, steady, rhythmic. Then I heard something worse. A voice, faint, almost pleading. "Let me out." I froze. The voice was muffled, like it was coming from behind a wall. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call someone. But call who? The police? And tell them what? That my elderly neighbor had someone knocking inside her house in the middle of the night? The knocking stopped. I sat there in the silence, my pulse pounding. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was half asleep. I tried to convince myself of that as I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked her house from my window. The curtains were drawn, no sign of movement. I decided to confront her. I knocked on her door, and after a long pause, she opened it. Her face was pale, her eyes slightly sunken. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," I said. "Sorry to bother you, but is everything okay? I heard some noises last night. Thought maybe you needed help." For a second, I saw something flicker across her expression. Fear, regret. Then she smiled. "Oh, I talk in my sleep sometimes," she said. "I hope I didn't wake you." I nodded, but I knew she was lying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. And then the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more desperate. "Please, let me out." I jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and made my way outside. The cold air bit at my skin as I approached her house. I stood on her porch, hesitating. Then, against all common sense, I tried the doorknob. It turned. The door swung open with a slow creak. A musty smell hit me immediately. The air was thick with dust and something else, something rancid. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The furniture was covered in dust, old and untouched. It looked like no one had lived there in years. But that was impossible. I had seen her. I had spoken to her. A sound came from down the hall, a faint, scraping noise. I followed it, my breath shallow. The sound was coming from a door at the end of the hallway, the basement. I hesitated. The knocking had stopped, but I could feel something behind that door. Slowly, I reached out and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a set of wooden stairs leading into darkness. The smell was stronger now. I took a step down, then another. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the basement, and I saw it. A small wooden door built into the wall, old, rotting, and covered in deep, frantic scratch marks. I stared, my stomach twisting. The knocking hadn't been coming from the walls, it had been coming from inside that door. I turned and ran. I sprinted out of that house, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked my own door, my mind racing. The next day, I called the landlord. I needed answers. But what he told me made my blood run cold. There hasn't been a Mrs. Collins living there for years, he said. The last owner was an old woman by that name, but she passed away a long time ago. I stammered. That's not possible. I talked to her. She brought me cookies. She lives next door. A long pause. Son, he said slowly, that house has been abandoned for over 20 years. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain. I packed my things and moved out by the end of the week. I never looked back. But sometimes late at night I wake up to the sound of knocking and a voice. Soft. Please let me out. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a fresh start. I had just moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood after a messy breakup. I needed to get away from the chaos of the city, find some peace, and perhaps rediscover myself. The house was small, modest, but it was perfect for someone like me, a single woman looking to put down roots in a calm, stable place. The neighbors seemed nice enough when I first arrived. The woman next door, Mrs. Walker, was an older lady who always wore a smile and waved whenever I stepped outside. She had a garden full of roses, and on occasion she'd bring me a fresh bouquet. Just a little something for the new neighbor, she'd say. I'm sure you'll love them here. Her kindness made me feel welcome, and I thought I had found the perfect neighborhood to begin my new life. Little did I know that the atmosphere was deceptive. Beneath the peaceful facade, something sinister lurked. It started with small things at first, things that I chalked up to coincidence. I would come home to find my mailbox open, but I hadn't opened it myself. A window would be slightly ajar when I knew I had closed it earlier. The first few times I told myself I was being paranoid, adjusting to a new environment, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It wasn't until a week later that things took a darker turn. I woke up in the middle of the night to a soft knock on my door. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, a steady, deliberate knock. Groggy and confused, I glanced at the clock. 2:30 a.m. Who would be at my door at this hour? I was scared. I wasn't sure what to do, so I waited. After what seemed like forever, the knocking stopped. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and tiptoed downstairs, trying to keep the house as quiet as possible. I peeked out the window and saw nothing, but that didn't ease the fear gnawing at me. I turned off the lights and locked the door, my heart pounding. The next morning, I convinced myself it was probably just a random occurrence. Maybe it was a neighbor, perhaps Mrs. Walker, trying to be friendly at an odd hour. But when I checked my security cameras, I was horrified. There was footage of a figure standing by my porch at 2:30 a.m., but it wasn't Mrs. Walker or anyone I recognized. The figure was cloaked in darkness, and I could barely make out their shape, but I knew they were watching my house. They stood there for what felt like hours, barely moving until the footage cut off just before they walked away. I was shaken. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Was it just some prank? But that thought felt wrong. It wasn't a prank. It felt personal. For the next few days, I kept to myself, staying inside and keeping the blinds drawn. Every time I stepped outside, I checked the porch, the yard, the street, looking for anything unusual, but nothing ever seemed out of place. At least, not until the following Saturday. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen when I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch. I froze, heart in my throat, and crept toward the window. To my surprise, it was Mrs. Walker standing at my door. She smiled warmly when she saw me peeking through the blinds. "Hello, dear," she called out cheerfully. "I was just wondering if you might need anything. Maybe some more roses for your garden?" I opened the door cautiously, trying to mask my unease. Mrs. Walker's bright blue eyes sparkled, but there was something in her smile that seemed too wide, too practiced. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm actually just getting settled, but I'm sure I could use some. She reached into the large bag she was carrying and pulled out a bouquet of fresh, vibrant roses. I thought you'd like them. They're from my garden. She handed them to me, and I took them with trembling hands. As she turned to leave, she glanced over her shoulder. You know, I saw someone out here late last night, someone in a hooded jacket. They were just standing there, staring at your door. It was strange, but you're safe now, dear. I felt my stomach twist in knots. Someone was outside, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, she nodded, her face softening. But don't worry about it. I'm sure it was nothing. People around here are just curious. You know? Curious, you know? It happens sometimes. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't a coincidence. Whoever had been outside my door was clearly watching me, and now Mrs. Walker was confirming it. But she didn't seem concerned at all. In fact, she acted as if it was no big deal. After that day, things only got worse. My sense of paranoia deepened. Every sound, every movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. I started to feel like I was being watched at all hours of the day. One night, I decided to confront it. I wasn't going to hide in fear anymore. I set up my security cameras again, this time more strategically, ensuring I could monitor every corner of my property. I stayed up late, watching the footage, waiting for something to happen. Around 1:45 a.m., I saw it. A shadow moved in the yard, just outside the reach of the camera's light. The figure appeared again, and this time I could see more clearly. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black hoodie. He stopped at the edge of the yard, stared at my windows, then slowly began walking towards the porch. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. My hands were clammy as I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But before I could, the figure stopped and turned back. He wasn't coming to the door. He was heading for Mrs. Walker's house. That's when I saw it. Mrs. Walker's porch light flickered on. The man and she exchanged a few words, too far away for me to hear, but I could see their silhouettes. The man nodded and walked toward her front door, disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I knocked on Mrs. Walker's door, demanding to know what was going on. Mrs. Walker, I said, barely able to hide the fear in my voice. I saw the man last night. He was at your house, wasn't he? She smiled and patted my hand as if the conversation wasn't serious at all. Oh dear, you've misunderstood. That man is just an old friend. He's harmless. We were just catching up, nothing to worry about. But I could see the lie in her eyes, the subtle way her gaze shifted, the way she quickly closed the door when I tried to ask more. That's when I realized something terrible. Mrs. Walker wasn't just a sweet old lady. She was part of this, part of something dark and twisted. She was helping him, watching me. I didn't know who he was or why he was targeting me, but I knew that it wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was a pattern. I was being watched, studied, and I had no idea what they wanted. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my bags that afternoon, locked up the house, and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Mrs. Walker stood on her porch staring at me, her smile wide as ever, but her eyes, they were different now, empty, unblinking. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I moved to the small town of Millville about 2 years ago. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been frozen in time. Quiet streets, simple houses, and people who still remembered the value of a friendly conversation. I had grown tired of the big city life where everyone kept to themselves, and the fast-paced grind was eating me alive. Millville seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. At first, everything was perfect. My new neighbors, the Harrisons, lived next door. A quiet couple in their late 50s, they had lived in the house for as long as anyone could remember. Their yard was immaculate, their porch always swept clean, and they had this golden retriever named Max who would greet me every morning with a wag of his tail. They were friendly but reserved, nothing too intrusive, just the right amount of neighborliness. I didn't mind that. It was nice to feel like I was part of a community without being smothered. One evening I was sitting in my living room when I saw Mrs. Harrison standing in her front yard, staring at my house. I thought nothing of it at first. Maybe she was just admiring the sunset. But then she stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like an uncomfortable amount of time. I could feel her gaze through the window like she was watching me. The next day, I bumped into her at the mailbox. She smiled at me, though it seemed a bit strained. "I hope you're settling in well," she said, her voice warm but with a strange undertone. "Yeah, I'm loving it here," I replied, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had settled in my chest. "Everything's been great so far." "Good," she said, her smile widening, though her eyes seemed to darken a little. "Just make sure you're careful. Some things in this town aren't what they seem." Then, just as quickly as she said it, she walked back to her house, leaving me standing there, puzzled and slightly uneasy. I didn't give it much thought at the time. People say strange things sometimes, and I figured she was just being neighborly, maybe a little too much so. But in the following days, I started noticing more and more weird things. It began with small stuff. The lights in my house would flicker at night, but when I checked, all the switches were in the off position. My front door would sometimes be slightly ajar when I was sure I'd locked it. One morning, I found a small, neatly folded towel in my mailbox, but there was no note or explanation. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my house, though I had no real proof. Then there were the sounds, scratching noises in the walls late at night. I would lie awake, listening, but when I checked, nothing was there. It was driving me crazy. The kind of thing that makes you question your own sanity. It wasn't long before the Harrisons' odd behavior started to escalate. Mrs. Harrison would appear on her porch at all hours of the day, watching me. And Mr. Harrison, well, he had always been a bit more distant, but now he seemed to be lurking in the shadows, never directly addressing me when we crossed paths. It was as if they were both always around, but never fully present, always just out of reach. One night, things took a darker turn. I came home late from work, my mind exhausted after a long day. As I walked up the driveway, I saw Mr. Reide Harrison standing in the yard, holding a lantern. He didn't look at me, but I could feel his gaze heavy on my back. The strange thing was that he wasn't looking at anything in particular, just staring into the darkness as if waiting for something. "Mr. Harrison?" I called out, but he didn't answer. I took a few cautious steps forward. "Are you okay?" I asked, but still no response. I was starting to feel unnerved, but before I could speak again, he slowly turned his head and looked me in the eyes. His expression was blank, but his eyes, they were different. There was a hollow emptiness to them, like he wasn't really there anymore. His lips barely moved as he spoke in a slow, deliberate whisper. "You shouldn't have come here. It's too late now." I froze, my blood running cold. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling, but before he could respond, Mrs. Harrison appeared behind him, a strange smile on her face, as though nothing was amiss. "It's getting late, dear," she said in her sweet voice, but I noticed the subtle edge in her tone. "You should go inside. You wouldn't want to be out here after dark." I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in me told me to turn and run, but I didn't. I just nodded and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of the Harrisons, their cryptic words, and their unsettling behavior. The noises in my walls returned, louder this time, almost like scratching claws. I jumped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight, thinking maybe there was an animal in the attic or something. I climbed into the attic space, scanning the dark corners with my light. But when the beam landed on something strange, my heart stopped. There, in the far corner of the attic, was a pile of old photographs. They were scattered across the floor, half buried under dust and cobwebs. I knelt down and picked up the first one. It was a picture of the Harrison family from what must have been years ago. But then I flipped it over, and there was something written on the back. "She's watching. She always watches." My breath caught in my throat. I turned over more photos, each one with that same eerie message scrawled on the back. I couldn't get out of the attic fast enough. I bolted down the stairs and grabbed my phone, trying to call the police, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. I ran outside to my car, desperate to leave, but before I could even start the engine, I saw them. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, standing at the end of my driveway, watching me. They didn't move, just stood there, staring. I slammed the car door and drove off, not caring about the speed limit. I didn't stop until I reached the town's edge, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I ended up driving out to the next town, staying at a motel for the night. When I finally returned to Millville, the house was exactly as I left it, but things were different. The walls felt colder, the air heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, that they were still there. I never spoke again. Never spoke to the Harrisons again. They disappeared a few days later as though they had never been there at all. Their house was left empty, the windows dark and uninviting. No one in town ever mentioned them again, as if they had never existed. But sometimes late at night, I'll hear scratching sounds from the walls of my house, and if I stand too close to the window, I swear I can still feel someone watching me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had always prided myself on being a quiet, unassuming person. When I moved into the small suburban neighborhood of Bellwood, I didn't expect to make waves or become close friends with anyone. I wanted peace, and Bellwood seemed like the perfect place to find it. The houses were modest, but well-maintained, the streets lined with trees that looked like something straight out of a postcard. My neighbor, Mr. Clayton, seemed like an ordinary man at first. Mid-50s, balding with a salt and pepper beard, and a slight limp that he had mentioned was due to an old injury from his time in the military. In the beginning, our interactions were limited to polite waves and occasional small talk when I was out tending to my lawn. He seemed nice enough, always asking how I was doing or how my work was going. His wife, Mary, had passed away a few years ago, leaving him to live alone in the house next door. He'd told me that he missed her terribly, but his voice never cracked when he spoke of her. It was always steady, controlled, like a man trying to mask a deeper pain. The first thing that struck me as odd happened on a Tuesday evening about a month after I had moved in. I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee when I noticed Mr. Clayton standing at the edge of his driveway, staring at my house. At first, I thought he might just be lost in thought or waiting for something, but after a while, I realized that he hadn't moved a muscle. His gaze was fixed directly on my front door. It was unsettling, but I didn't think much of it. People stare sometimes, right? But when I looked out a second time, he was still standing there, unmoving, like a statue. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I half expected him to approach me, but he never did. He just stood there, staring. I decided to go inside after a while, chalking it up to a strange quirk of his, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about him. The next evening, I went for a walk around the block to clear my head. It was just before dusk, and the street was quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. As I walked past Mr. Clayton's house, I noticed that the front window was slightly ajar. It was the first time I had seen any movement inside the house. I stopped for a moment, trying to make out any shapes through the window, but it was too dark to see much. Then, as I continued down the street, I heard a voice. Soft, low, almost a whisper. It was coming from the direction of Mr. Clayton's house. I turned around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the street was still. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It sounded like Mary, his wife. But how could that be? She had been dead for years. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the voice stayed with me for the rest of the walk, echoing in the back of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard scratching noises coming from the walls. At first, I thought it might be mice or some other critter, but the scratching was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't until the following morning that I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was stepping out of my front door when I noticed a set of footprints in the freshly fallen snow, footprints that led directly from Mr. Clayton's house to mine. They were clear and deep, as if someone had been walking around in my yard in the middle of the night. I couldn't believe it. The prints were too fresh to be from the day before, but there were no signs of anyone around. No one had knocked on my door. No one had rung my bell. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe a neighbor had walked by, or maybe it was just some odd coincidence. I tried to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that kept creeping into my thoughts. Over the next few days, the behavior of Mr. Clayton began to escalate. He would stand at the window, staring at me as I went about my day. Sometimes I would see him standing in the exact same spot, unmoving, for hours on end. It was as though he was waiting for something, or someone. When I would wave at him, he would nod back, but there was an unnatural quality to his movements, like he was too deliberate, too controlled. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront him. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I walked over to his house, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked on the door, but it took a moment before he answered. When he did, he seemed surprised to see me, though he quickly masked it with a smile. "Ah, it's you," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. "What can I do for you? I just wanted to ask if everything's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've noticed you've been standing outside a lot lately. Is everything all right?" He tilted his head, a small, almost sad smile on his face. "Everything's fine, just thinking." It was then that I noticed something strange. Behind him, I could see an old photo album open on the table. The photos were blurry, hard to make out, but one image stood out. A picture of Mr. Clayton and a woman, Mary, I presumed, standing together in front of the house. But in the background, just barely visible, was a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was blurry, like they hadn't been meant to be seen. Before I could ask about the photo, Mr. Clayton seemed to sense my unease. "It's just an old habit," he said, his voice tight. "You know how it is. Sometimes when you've lost someone, you do things to remember them." I nodded, though I didn't quite understand. There was something in his eyes that told me he was hiding something, something that made me wish I had never knocked on his door. Over the next few days, things took a turn for the worse. I began to feel as though I wasn't alone in my own house. I would hear footsteps behind me when I was in the kitchen, or a door would creak open when I was certain I had locked it. The unease grew into something tangible, something that made my skin crawl. Then, one night, I woke to the sound of someone breathing heavily outside my window. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I crept out of bed and moved to the window. When I looked out, I saw Mr. Clayton standing there, his face pressed up against the glass. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, horrified, but when I turned back to the window, he was gone. The next morning, I went to his house to ask about the incident. I needed answers. But when I knocked on his door, no one answered. I tried the back door, the windows, nothing. It was as if he had disappeared. It wasn't until later that I found out from another neighbor that Mr. Clayton had passed away quietly in his sleep the night before. His funeral was held a few days later, and though I attended, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I don't know what happened, but I do know one thing. Whatever it wasn't Mr. Clayton I was dealing with in those final days. His presence, his behavior, it was all wrong. I still don't know if it was his grief or something else entirely, but I do know I'll never forget the terror I felt those last few weeks. Sometimes, when I sit in my living room, I swear I hear scratching noises coming from the walls again, and when I glance outside, I see the faint outline of a man standing in the yard, watching me. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I had just moved to the quiet town of Hawthorne, a place where everyone knew everyone, or so it seemed. My house was a modest 2-story on a peaceful street with rows of oak trees lining the sidewalk. It was exactly what I had been looking for, a safe, quiet neighborhood to settle into after years of living in the chaos of the city. The first few weeks were uneventful. My neighbors were friendly but not overly intrusive, which suited me just fine. There was the Johnson family on one side, Mark and Emma, both in their late 30s, with 2 young children. On the other side was Mrs. Granger, an elderly woman who lived alone. She always seemed pleasant enough when we crossed paths, waving to me from her front porch with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't think much of it. Some people just had that distant look, right? It was one Saturday afternoon when things first started to feel off. I was outside mowing the lawn when I noticed Mrs. Granger standing by her front door, just watching me. I smiled and waved, thinking it was just a normal neighborly moment, but she didn't wave back. Instead, she just stood there, her eyes fixed on me, her mouth set in a tight line. It didn't feel right, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just lost in thought, or maybe I was just being paranoid. But over the next few days, things began to escalate. I started hearing strange noises coming from Mrs. Granger's house at night. It was always after dark, and always when I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. There were strange dragging sounds, as if something heavy was being moved across the floor. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the noises were so consistent and rhythmic that it started to gnaw at me. I considered going over to check on her, but then I reminded myself that she was elderly and probably just had some old pipes or furniture that creaked. It wasn't my place to pry, so I kept my distance. But then, one evening, I came home from work to find a note on my doorstep. It was handwritten, the ink a bit smudged as if it had been written in a hurry. It read, "I know you're watching me." There was no signature, no explanation, just that simple, chilling sentence. I looked around, wondering if anyone had seen me pick it up, but the street was as quiet as usual. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring at the note in disbelief. Who could have left it? The only person I had interacted with recently was Mrs. Granger, and I couldn't imagine why she would write something like this. That night, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a joke, some kind of weird prank. But as I lay in bed, the noises from Mrs. Granger's house started up again. This time, there was a loud banging sound followed by a deep thud. I shot out of bed, my heart racing, and I grabbed my phone to call her. The phone rang once, twice, no answer. I tried again, this time more urgently. Still nothing. I knew I couldn't just sit around anymore. I had to go over there, make sure she was okay. The thought of her lying there, alone and in trouble, gnawed at me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out the door. As I approached her house, I noticed the front porch light was on, but there was no movement inside. The windows were dark, and the only sound was the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no response. I started to feel foolish. Maybe she was asleep, or maybe she was just out. But then, something caught my eye. Through the thin gap in the curtains, I could just make out the shape of someone standing inside the house, still unmoving. It was hard to tell, but it looked like Mrs. Granger. I knocked once more, louder, and this time I could swear I heard a soft scuffling noise from inside. "Mrs. Granger?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you all right?" There was no reply. The figure inside didn't move. The air around me felt thick, like I was waiting for something to happen. I reached for the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, and dust covered the furniture like a thin blanket. I called out for Mrs. Granger again, my voice echoing through the empty house, but there was still no answer. I moved cautiously down the hallway, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. In the living room, there was a small table with a collection of old photographs scattered across it. At first, I thought they might be family photos, but as I got closer, I realized something was off. The photographs were of me, my house, my car, even my backyard. It was as if someone had been taking pictures of me without my knowledge. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands trembled as I picked up one of the photos. It was an image of me mowing the lawn from the other day. Just like Mrs. Granger had been watching me, but I had never seen anyone else standing in the yard. I turned quickly, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Mrs. Granger," I called out, louder now. "Where are you?" The house was silent again, but this time something felt different. I heard the faintest sound from the stairs, a soft creaking like someone was slowly descending. My pulse quickened. I turned and froze. Standing at the top of the stairs was Mrs. Granger, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was wearing an old nightgown, the fabric torn in places. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, but it was her eyes that I couldn't look away from. There was something in them that wasn't right, something that made my blood run cold. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, watching me. I couldn't move. The silence was unbearable, suffocating. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." I took a step back, suddenly aware of how wrong everything felt. "Mrs. Granger, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why did you leave that note? What is all this?" Her eyes flickered briefly to the photographs on the table, then back to me. She took a slow, deliberate step down the stairs. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely audible, but there was a strange edge to it, a twisted calmness. "I've been watching you too." I felt the weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. What was she talking about? But before I could say anything else, she took another step, and the flashlight in my hand flickered out. The house was plunged into darkness. The last thing I remember is the sound of her footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer until everything went black. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I never imagined moving into a small suburban neighborhood would bring anything but peace. It had been a hectic few years for me, dealing with work stress, a broken relationship, and the constant pressure of life in a big city. So, when the opportunity to move into a quiet neighborhood came up, I jumped at it. The house was a bit older than I'd hoped, but it had character. It was perfect for starting fresh. The first few weeks went by without incident. I met the neighbors, an older couple, the Parkers, lived to my left, and the Smiths, a younger family, lived to my right. Both families were friendly, waved when we passed each other on the sidewalk, and offered introductions when I first arrived. Nothing seemed out of place. I felt at home. Then I met my other neighbor, Mrs. Dalrymple. Mrs. Dalrymple lived 2 houses down, in a house that was larger than most on the street, but was also very secluded. She had a large, overgrown yard that seemed out of place compared to the neatly manicured lawns around it. She was an older woman, well into her 70s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. I first encountered her when I was unloading boxes from my car. She walked slowly toward me with her cane, her eyes locked onto mine. "New neighbor?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yes, I just moved in," I replied, trying to be friendly. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, good luck with all that moving. It can be a bit much." I smiled back, unsure of how to respond. Something about her presence unsettled me. Maybe it was her eyes, always analyzing, always watching. Or maybe it was the way she moved, slow, deliberate, but with an unsettling sense of purpose. That was the beginning of it. A week after I moved in, Mrs. Dalrymple appeared at my door, a basket of cookies in hand. I was surprised and a bit confused since we hadn't spoken much. "Thought I'd bring you something," she said with a smile that still didn't reach her eyes. "I've made extra. My husband, God rest his soul, always loved these." She handed me the basket, and I thanked her. It seemed like a kind gesture, but there was something about the way she lingered at the doorstep that felt off. She stood there a little too long, watching me with those sharp, calculating eyes. "Don't stay out too late around here, dear," she added, her tone changing just slightly. "People come and go. You never know who's really around." I nodded, still unsure of how to take her words, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, what harm was there in a neighbor offering cookies? But the next day, the first of many strange occurrences happened. I woke up early to a strange scraping sound coming from outside. Thinking it was just a tree branch scraping against the window, I ignored it and got ready for work. When I opened the blinds, however, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of my yard, was Mrs. Dalrymple, holding her cane, staring directly at my window. She wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. I froze. My first instinct was to go back inside, but I couldn't stop staring at her. It was as if she was waiting for me to notice her. Then, without saying a word, she turned and walked back to her house, disappearing into the shadows of her overgrown yard. I didn't know what to think. I assumed it was some strange coincidence, or perhaps she had simply been walking by. But the feeling didn't go away. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that Mrs. Dalrymple was always around. She'd be out in her yard whenever I was outside, working on something or walking to my car. She would smile, wave, and sometimes even speak, but there was always something strange in the way she did it. Her questions seemed too probing, her gaze too intense. It was as if she knew more about me than she should. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, reading a book when I heard the knock. I glanced at the clock. It was 8:30 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, it was Mrs. Dalrymple again, this time standing in the dark with a strange look on her face. "I forgot to tell you, dear," she said in a whisper. "The house you're living in, it's had some interesting people come and go. Not all of them stay." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she was implying. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She paused, looking over her shoulder as if making sure no one else was around. "I'm just saying, some people can't handle this place. It's too unsettling for them." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, confused and unsettled. The next few nights were restless. I kept hearing noises outside, scraping sounds, soft whispers that would stop the moment I looked out the window. I even started to find strange marks on my front door, like scratches that weren't there before. I thought maybe I was just tired, stressed from the move, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Then, one afternoon, I noticed something chilling. I had come home early from work and was walking up my front steps when I looked toward Mrs. Dalrymple's house. Her windows, usually covered by heavy curtains, were open, and I saw her standing inside, watching me. She didn't move, just stared at me from across the yard. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the very next day, I saw her standing in her yard, watching me through the window again. This time, she wasn't alone. There was a man standing next to her, tall, with dark eyes and an expression I couldn't read. They both just stood there, staring at me. That night, the tapping on my window started. At first, it was soft, almost like the wind. Then it grew louder and louder until it became a persistent, rhythmic banging. I tried to ignore it, but the fear grew unbearable. I pulled the curtains back to see who was out there, and there, standing in the dark, was Mrs. Dalrymple. Her face was twisted in an expression I can't even describe, half smiling, half sneering. She didn't move, just stood there, her eyes fixed on mine. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I backed away from the window, closing the blinds, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I could hear the tapping still, now faint, but constant. I had to get out of there. The next morning, I went to the local police station. I didn't know what else to do. When I explained the situation, the officer gave me a concerned look. "Mrs. Dalrymple?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're not the first one to have trouble with her. She's been here for years, and before her there were others who, well, they left. You'd be wise to keep your distance." "Left?" I asked, confused. He looked at me, his face serious. "The people who lived in your house before you? They all moved out quickly. No one really talks about it, but, well, people around here don't stay for long. Something about the place gets to them." I left the police station, shaken and terrified. That night, I packed my bags and never looked back. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Mrs. Dalrymple was standing in her front yard, watching me leave. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were empty. I didn't stay in that town. I couldn't. Story the end.